Meanwhile, in South Australia, the Stewart challenge was on again.
Mr. Keckwick! Don't slacken your pace, man! Keep moving! Ah!
Right, men. Come on.
The Parliament had voted Stewart £2,500 to lead a large and well-equipped party to the north and beat Burke and Wills. By the middle of February 1861, Stewart was back on the track he knew so well and had reached the Fink River. But, unknown to him, the race was already won. Burke and Wills had followed an almost direct line through Western Queensland, walking 12 hours a day in dry country, until they struck tidal flats near the Gulf of Carpentaria. It had taken Burke and Wills 2 months to walk the 1,000 kilometres to the Gulf. The mangrove swamps on the Flinders River prevented them from seeing the open waters of the Gulf, but they had made the first crossing from sea to sea. Burke's party was in desperate need of a rest, but time and the weather were against them. Burke had only 1 month's time and 1 month's supplies to make the return trip to Cooper's Creek. So they turned round and began a night and day forced march. It was a desperate journey, and it cost them 4 of the camels and Burke's horse, Billy.
Right ahead, between the trees, near the creek.
Then Charlie Gray fell sick and died on April the 17th. 4 days later, they staggered back into their camp at Cooper's Creek, but they were too late. The men who'd been stationed here had waited an extra month, but they gave up and left just 7 hours before Burke returned. If Burke had not stopped to bury Gray's body, he'd have met the depot party. At first, Burke and Wills could not believe that they'd been deserted.
Pardon? McDonough? 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 They must have moved camp further up the creek.
I don't think so, Mr. Burke. Look. Give it to Mr. Burke.
The note from the leader of the depot party, Bray, said that nobody had come up from the Darling with supplies, and they were leaving that day to follow their southeast track back to Menindee. Burke, Wills and King were utterly devastated. They were too exhausted to follow Bray's party. In fact, they couldn't walk another step. Bray, for his part, had waited an extra month, but with his supplies running out and his men sick from scurvy, he felt he could wait no longer. Burke had been instructed to keep his party together at all times, but he insisted on racing for the north coast before he got all his men and all his supplies here to the depot at Cooper's Creek. With all the bungling at Menindee and in Melbourne, those extra supplies never reached Cooper's Creek, and that was the major cause of the tragedy. Robert O'Hara Burke had won the great race, but he was never to know it. And the message in the bottle here at the Dig Tree was the last message he ever had. On the day Burke and Wills returned to Cooper's Creek, April the 21st, 1861, John McDowell Stewart reached Tennant Creek, far to the northwest. 3 days later, he passed Attack Creek, where he'd had to abandon his last expedition. In late May, he reached Newcastle waters. From here, he tried for 2 months to reach the north coast, but was beaten back 11 times by dense scrub and lack of water. Stewart's last gesture before returning to Adelaide was to name a creek for a rival he called Richard O'Hara Burke. That brother explorer, Robert O'Hara Burke, would never know of this generous gesture. Burke had persuaded Wills and King to leave the Coopers Creek depot and to travel with him southwest down the creek, instead of southeast towards Menindee and the support party. 15 days after Burke and Wills had left the depot, Bray and another man, Wright, returned, just in case someone had turned up. But they noticed nothing.
4 months.
The ground by the dig tree looked undisturbed, and they didn't check to see if the stores were gone. The two men spent only 15 minutes at the camp. A closer look would have revealed traces of Burke and Wills. Some spilt nails, a billy, a broken bottle. Burke, Wills and King were at this moment only 50 kilometres away, down the creek. They had been beaten back by sandhills, and they now realised, too late, that their only hope was a rescue party. 3 weeks after Bray's visit, Wills struggled back up the creek to this tree, the dig tree. But he could see no sign of their visit. And when he dug near the tree, he found Burke's message still waiting there. All of them had kept disguising the things buried in the ground and raking earth over them because they didn't want the Aborigines to dig them up. But incredibly, none of the explorers, not Burke and Wills on their first return to Coopers Creek, not Bray and Wright on their return, and not Wills now on his second return, ever thought to blaze any other message on the dig tree. But Wills did leave one bitter last note buried in a bottle in the ground.
Depot camp, May 30th. Both camels are dead and our provisions are done. We are trying to live the best way we can like the blacks, but find it hard work. My pulse is at 48 and very weak, and my legs and arms are nearly skin and bone.
6 weeks after their return to Coopers Creek, Burke and Wills were both dead. King alone survived, through the nobility of a now vanished tribe, who took him into their camp and treated him with more humanity than most explorers could ever muster for Aborigines. A rescue party, led by a skilled bushman, Alfred Howard, arrived at last from Melbourne. But there was nothing they could do for Burke and Wills, except bury them. It was September the 21st, 1861. By the time Stewart launched his third attempt to cross the continent, he knew of the melancholy fate of Burke and Wills.
Men are ready, Mr. Stewart.
He also knew that they had reached the north coast before him. But Stewart had explored so efficiently and discovered so much on his first 2 expeditions across the centre that the South Australian government backed him for another try.
We'll maintain this northerly bearing, Mr. Keckwick. Mount up! Move out!
In January 1862, he left Finnis Springs, near Lake Eyre, with a strong party. The men were mostly young South Australians. They carried no heavy surveying equipment. Everything was designed for speed and mobility. They had carbines, and every man had a pistol in his belt. This time, they meant to get through. Stewart had already blazed most of the track that was to be followed by an overland telegraph line, and he was back at Newcastle Waters by April 1862. Burke and Wills had followed an almost direct line through Western Queensland, walking 12 hours a day in dry country, until they struck tidal flats near the Gulf of Carpentaria.
Move in! Ah!
Right, men. Come on.
The Parliament had voted Stewart £2,500 to lead a large and well-equipped party to the north and beat Burke and Wills. Meanwhile, in South Australia, the Stewart challenge was on again.
Mr. Keckwick! Don't slacken your pace, man! Keep...
By the middle of February 1861, Stewart was back on the track he knew so well and had reached the Fink River. But, unknown to him, the race was already won. It had taken Burke and Wills 2 months to walk the 1,000 kilometres to the Gulf. The mangrove swamps on the Flinders River prevented them from seeing the open water.